In a live congressional hearing broadcast across the nation, Jasmine Crockett locked eyes with Nancy Mace after Mace declared that Black Lives Matter was a divisive, violent force tearing America apart. The chamber held its breath, but Crockett didn't take the bait. She waited, and when she finally rose, it wasn't anger she brought. It was the cold clarity of lived injustice, historical betrayal, and a system still steeped in silence. With videos, testimonies, and Mace's own past words turned against her, Crockett didn't just respond. She dismantled a narrative in front of millions. So what did Jasmine say? That broke Mace in front of the entire nation. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing was supposed to be routine, another televised roundtable about civil cohesion in post-protest America. But at exactly 11:32 a.m., with every major network streaming live and the C-SPAN ticker quietly crawling beneath the screen, Congresswoman Nancy Mace leaned toward her mic and dropped a political grenade. Black Lives Matter, she said coolly, is a divisive movement, one that's fueled violence and turned Americans against each other. Her words sliced through the room like a scalpel. For half a second, there was nothing. No coughs, no whispers, just dead air. And then the eruption began, not in the chamber, but outside of it. Twitter feeds detonated. Conservative outlets clipped the quote and launched headlines like missiles. Mace speaks truth about BLM. On the other side, rage ignited like dry timber. Hashtags flew. Activist groups reacted within seconds. But in the room, one figure hadn't moved. Camera 3 caught the shot just in time. Tight on Jasmine Crockett. Her eyes didn't flinch, not even a blink. Her right hand gripped the folder in front of her, knuckles tightening as the insult ricocheted in her chest like a bullet she'd seen fired too many times. Her silence was thunderous. Not weak, not frozen, calculating. Her lips were pressed into a line that wasn't fear. It was focus. She didn't look at Mace. She didn't need to. She looked forward, unmoved, the calm eye in the center of a rapidly forming storm. Somewhere beyond the cameras, she could already hear the streets murmuring. Her phone, face down on the table, was lighting up every few seconds. She didn't touch it. She didn't need the world's outrage. She was the response being summoned. The storm didn't break. Not yet. But the pressure in the chamber thickened, like the air before a lightning strike that everyone knows is coming and no one dares to summon. Jasmine slowly lifted her eyes from the center of the table. Her voice, when it came, was low, measured. Not the rebuttal everyone expected, but something far more dangerous. "Mr. Chairman," she said, her tone like steel beneath silk, "I respectfully request to deliver my remarks at the end of the session." A pause swept through the room, unnatural and extended. The panel froze, caught off guard by the restraint, the control, the sheer calm in her ask. The chairman blinked, nodded, then looked at Mace, as if silently asking if she understood what she'd awakened. But Mace only smiled, a slow, smug grin spreading across her face like she'd just landed the knockout blow. In her mind, the silence meant surrender. In her mind, Jasmine's delay was hesitation, not calculation. She sat back in her chair, adjusted her blazer, and crossed her legs with rehearsed elegance. She thought she'd won the image war. She thought Jasmine had blinked. Outside the chamber, however, the silence was anything but passive. Reporters watching from behind glass panels began typing frantically. Why didn't Crockett respond? Is she retreating or preparing something deeper? One Politico correspondent tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just passed on the mic. Something's up." On MSNBC, a chyron rolled. Crockett silent after Mace slams BLM for now. In group chats, activists, lawyers, and organizers exchanged one sentence over and over. "She's waiting. She's loading." And inside the room, Jasmine sat still as granite. Her hands released the folder, but only slightly. She was no longer gripping it. She was guarding it. That file wasn't just paper. It was a weapon. And what Nancy Mace didn't understand was that Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to win a headline. She was here to carve a truth into history, and truth doesn't shout. It strikes. The name Jasmine Crockett was called with no fanfare, but the shift in the room was unmistakable. Staffers who had been whispering froze mid-sentence. Aides lowered their phones. Even the sound technicians paused their adjustments. It wasn't just her turn. It was her moment, and the chamber knew it. Jasmine leaned forward slowly, resting her elbows on the table like she was lowering herself into the cockpit of something engineered for precision impact. She didn't need to check notes. She didn't even glance at her folder. She only looked ahead, face calm, voice quiet, but locked with purpose. "It's strange," she said, the air taut with expectancy, "how someone who once claimed to stand for justice now throws an entire movement under the bus, just because a few clips made it easy to lie." The sentence didn't shout, but it slapped. It exposed. The kind of line that didn't need to rise in pitch because it cut with content. The room didn't breathe, it listened. Somewhere in the corner, the lens of CNN's live feed adjusted focus, zeroing in on Mace's reaction. Her jaw tensed. Her shoulders drew inward by half an inch. Jasmine tapped a discreet button. The lights dimmed. Not dramatically, but enough to shift the attention. The wall monitor behind her glowed to life, and without warning, the first video began. The footage was raw. No narration, no soundtrack. A crowd of Black Lives Matter protesters, hands up, kneeling on a sun-bleached street in Louisville. Signs read, "Justice for Breonna." The chanting was rhythmic, mournful. Then chaos, riot police charging information, shields out, clubs swinging. A young woman screamed off camera. Another protester was tackled, head hitting the pavement with a thud so sharp the room seemed to flinch. Jasmine didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The image burned itself into the minds of everyone watching. Without a breath, the second video played. It was shorter, but devastating. A grainy clip of George Floyd. No voiceover, no commentary. Just the full shot. His neck pinned under an officer's knee, his voice slipping from pleading to silence. The timestamp in the corner ticked forward, cruel in its precision. Members of the panel shifted. A staffer in the third row wiped a tear and tried to hide it. Jasmine remained motionless, her eyes fixed forward, not reliving it, but presenting it. This wasn't for spectacle. This was evidence. Then the third and final video played. The lighting in the room shifted slightly, as if reality itself recoiled. The footage was from 2020, shakier quality, a town hall meeting in Charleston. Nancy Mace stood before a crowd, voice passionate. "I believe the Black Lives Matter movement has awakened this country," she declared. "It's not about division, it's about recognition." The contrast between that Mace and the one who had spoken hours earlier was so jarring it almost felt like a different person. But it wasn't. It was the same voice, same face, exposed in contradiction. Jasmine finally spoke again, but she didn't gloat. Her voice was calm, even restrained. "So I ask, when did justice become inconvenient? When did the truth become optional? Was it before or after the camera showed up?" Every syllable was calculated, every pause deliberate. The silence that followed wasn't just shock, it was reckoning. Mace's eyes darted, first toward the chairman, then to the cameras, then to the screen behind Jasmine, as if wishing it would simply turn off. Her hands shifted restlessly in her lap. Her lips pursed, then flattened. A bead of sweat broke near her temple. Not enough to embarrass, just enough to betray her unraveling calm. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop by degrees. The mahogany walls no longer gleamed. They loomed. Jasmine wasn't just speaking. She was dismantling something. Not just a person, not just a claim, but a carefully curated version of reality that had been fed to the public for years. And in that moment, with no theatrics, no yelling, no table pounding, she made it bleed. And still, she wasn't done. But she didn't rush. Because this wasn't just rebuttal. This was testimony on behalf of the unseen. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't going to let truth be rushed, not when the lie had been broadcast with such confidence. She let the silence hold, let it dig into everyone present, until the room had to admit the temperature hadn't changed. The truth had simply entered. The silence left by the last clip didn't fade. It shifted. It became something weightier, something alert, something that dared not be broken. Jasmine leaned forward, not as a performer, but as a surgeon preparing the next incision. Her fingers moved with quiet certainty as she tapped the control pad again, and this time, the screen behind her didn't show faces. It showed numbers. The title at the top, stark and bold. Unarmed black civilians killed by law enforcement. 18-month reporting window. Then the list appeared. Names, ages, locations, circumstances. A row of columns that should have belonged to a spreadsheet, not a courtroom. But here they were, each one a scar America refused to heal. 42, Jasmine said, her voice like tempered steel. 42 black men and women. Unarmed. Dead. She stood now, not for drama, but necessity. She walked slowly to the monitor, the gravity of her footsteps matching the weight of each word. Shot during traffic stops, suffocated during routine wellness checks, killed while walking home. She pointed to 3 entries. 17-year-old, no criminal record, 31-year-old veteran, 25-year-old teacher, mistaken identity. In all 42 cases, no weapon was ever recovered. No threat ever confirmed. Her hand lowered, but the tension in the room did not. These aren't talking points. They're tombstones. She turned to the panel again, the blue glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes like firelight in a storm. We are sitting here debating the morality of a movement, while the bodies that birthed it are still being buried. No one looked away. No one could, because to do so would have been an act of moral cowardice, and Jasmine had cornered them in their own silence. Then she lifted another document from her folder, this time stamped with the unmistakable crest of the United States Department of Justice. The room tensed. This wasn't activist material. This wasn't media narrative. This was the federal government speaking, through her voice. This, Jasmine said, unfolding the report so the cameras could catch the seal, is the DOJ's internal review of racial bias in law enforcement, dated just 9 months ago. She read from it directly without inflection, letting the words hang unaltered. African Americans are 2.7 times more likely to be stopped by law enforcement for non-moving violations. Use of force incidents involving unarmed black civilians remain disproportionately high compared to other racial groups, even after adjusting for crime rates and population density. She let that sit. That's not my opinion. That's your government. That's your data. Mace crossed her arms, but her hands were twitching. Subtle movements, thumb pressing into her palm, a single foot tapping in a rhythm she couldn't control. The camera saw it. America would see it. She shifted in her seat as if trying to escape the line of fire. But the truth didn't need to aim. It had already struck. Jasmine wasn't finished. She placed the report down and tapped her tablet once more. A second door in the back of the chamber opened quietly. The sound barely registered until the presence that followed did. A tall black man in a charcoal gray suit entered. No entourage, no flash, just calm, quiet composure. Jasmine didn't look back. She simply said, "This is Terrence Miller. He is a constituent of South Carolina's 1st Congressional District, Charleston." Her eyes cut toward Mace. "Your district, Congresswoman." Terrence stepped to the podium, adjusting the mic not with nervousness, but as someone who'd waited years to be heard. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "I was arrested at 28. They said I looked like someone. That's what they told me. I had a job, a record of clock-ins. I had my phone's GPS. They didn't care." He paused, his hands clenching the edges of the podium so tightly the wood creaked. "I spent 4 years in prison for something I didn't do. No weapon, no witness, no apology when it was overturned." He looked down, not in shame, but because the memory hurt too much to face straight on. When I asked why, they said it was just a mistake. Jasmine stood still beside him, arms folded, not in defiance but in solidarity. She didn't touch him. She didn't need to. Her posture said everything. "I brought him here because the truth you've tried to bury has a pulse." The silence in the room was not empty. It was full. Full of what hadn't been said. Full of what had been ignored. And the cameras, cold, impartial, unforgiving, swung to Nancy Mace. This time, they did not catch a confident smile. They caught a woman unraveling by millimeters. Her shoulders curled inward. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes flicked toward the clock, then to her aide, then back to the table. But there was no script for this. There was no pivot when the person you erased from the narrative walks into the room breathing. There was no recovery when receipts came with scars. Jasmine didn't speak again. She didn't need to. The data had landed. The voice had spoken. The image had been framed. And now the entire country was watching, not just the facts, but the face of someone forced to confront them. The air in the hearing chamber had turned dense, electric, not from theatrics, but from something far more destabilizing, undeniable reality. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to offer catharsis. She was here to finish what injustice started and to drag every lie into the light. She stepped toward the screen again, eyes steady, movements slow, as if every gesture had weight. "Let's talk about violence," she said, not as a suggestion, but as a command. Her voice was calm, but carried the stillness of a gun barrel before recoil. A new graphic filled the screen, clean, sharp, irrefutable. At the top, the words, Harvard Law Review, National Protest Behavior Study. She didn't need to dramatize it. The facts spoke for themselves. Over 7,300 Black Lives Matter demonstrations were analyzed, she said, her finger tracing the chart as if underlining a courtroom exhibit. More than 93% were peaceful, not speculative, not estimated, documented. The visual behind her showed it all, a wide bar of calm blue dwarfing a sliver of red. The violence, she continued, eyes sweeping across the committee, was not the rule. It was the exception. Yet somehow public memory has reversed that narrative. She let the words land with the weight they deserved, silent but seismic. No senator dared look away. The myth was dying in real time. Then, without a breath between, she tapped once more and shattered the chamber's remaining composure. The screen jolted to a new image, grainy, unedited footage captured from police body cams and student cell phones. A row of young people, black, white, Latino, linked arms on a sun-washed campus lawn. Their chant was simple, steady, hands up, don't shoot, no aggression, no destruction. And then out of nowhere, the crack of canisters, the thud of rubber bullets. Screams ripped through the speakers. A girl's body crumpled as a round struck her chest. Another staggered, clutching her face, blood streaming between her fingers. The crowd didn't fight. They scattered, disoriented, coughing, eyes wide with disbelief. Jasmine let the footage play longer than what was comfortable, longer than what media would ever broadcast, long enough for the room to sit with what really happened, without spin, without cuts, without anchors narrating away the cruelty. And then she turned, slowly, deliberately, to face the dais again. Her voice was almost a whisper, but it carved like a blade. "So I asked this body, since we are so quick to label entire movements as violent." Her eyes locked on Mace now, not as a peer, but as an accuser who had just presented the murder weapon. Who brought the riot gear to student protests? Who armed themselves to silence children with linked arms? Her pause wasn't hesitation, it was strategy. Let the question ferment. Let it soak through polished suits and scripted defenses. "You say Black Lives Matter promotes violence," she continued, her tone sharpening with every syllable. "But what do you call this? Law enforcement assaulting students with rubber bullets? Tactical squads treating peace like war?" Her hand swept toward the screen. "Tell me, what part of that is justice? What part of that is order?" Across the table, Nancy Mace stirred. Her face, once composed, was flushed crimson, creeping up her jawline like a rising tide of regret. Her breathing quickened. Her fingers clenched beneath the desk. And then, desperation. She reached for the microphone, her mouth already opening, some reflexive rebuttal forming in her throat. But before a sound escaped, the chairman raised his hand, firm and final. "Congresswoman Crockett has the floor." 6 words that landed like a closing iron gate. The room locked back into silence. Mace's hand froze in the air before retreating awkwardly, exposed and unsteady. Her face contorted, not just in frustration, but in dawning fear. Because this wasn't political banter anymore. This was a reckoning, and she was losing control of the story. The lights caught the sweat on her temple. The camera caught everything else. And Jasmine, she didn't move. She didn't gloat. She just stood beneath the truth she had summoned and let it burn through the room like sunlight through fog. The echo of Jasmine's question about police violence still lingered in the air, like a wound freshly opened, too raw to speak over, too real to dismiss. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to simply wound. She came to unmask. With deliberate calm, she turned again toward the digital console and pressed a final button. This time, the chamber lights didn't dim. The screen didn't explode. It quietly came alive with the unmistakable grain and color palette of a 4-year-old C-SPAN town hall. The voice that emerged was younger, but recognizable. It was Nancy Mace, before the national spotlight had hardened her edges, before the donors, before the Fox News hits, before the pivot. The video showed her standing at a wooden podium in Charleston, hands folded, eyes filled with practiced sincerity. "Black Lives Matter," she said into the microphone, "is a legitimate cry for help from communities we failed to hear." The crowd applauded. Mace nodded, placing her hand on her heart. "This isn't about politics," she continued. "It's about listening to pain and recognizing that our system hasn't worked for everyone equally." And then the clip ended, cut with precision, no voiceover, no dramatic sting, just silence and the live reflection of the woman who had once said it, now seated in the same room, having called BLM a divisive force hours earlier. Jasmine didn't look at the screen. She looked straight at Nancy Mace. And with a voice low but unmistakably sharpened by betrayal, she asked the question that detonated through the room. "So what happened, Congresswoman?" She stepped forward, not physically but in presence. "What changed between that podium and this one?" she continued, each word a scalpel. "Was it you, or was it the people who cut the checks?" The phrasing was surgical. The delivery, controlled detonation. She didn't need to accuse. She simply invited the room to consider the cost of silence, the price of ambition. "Because from where I'm standing," she added, her voice a shade colder, "it looks like you heard their cry until someone told you it wasn't profitable to listen anymore." The room froze, not in confusion, but in dread. Every chair leaned back just slightly, as if trying to escape the blast radius of a question that couldn't be deflected, only endured. The stenographer's keys stopped clicking. A cough from the back of the chamber was stifled before it finished. No one moved, no one whispered. Even the usual buzz of media personnel had gone dead. It was the kind of silence that only follows truth, uncomfortable, undeniable, and irreversible. Nancy Mace's posture shifted, just barely. Her eyes flicked toward the exit. Her lips parted, as if some defense were forming, but it never left her throat. She reached for her water but didn't drink. A blush crept across her cheeks. Not embarrassment, but exposure. Cameras slowly zoomed in, capturing every micro-expression like forensic evidence. The moment didn't need commentary. It was commentary. A woman who once called for justice now sat, unable to defend why she'd abandoned it. And Jasmine? She didn't move. She didn't push. She let the silence stretch, as if daring Mace, or the room itself, to reclaim what had just been stripped away. Because in that moment, no one could rescue her. Not her donors, not her staff, not even her own past words. They were playing on loop now, in the minds of every person watching, on screens across the country, and in the mirror Mace could no longer avoid. The chamber was still in the grip of a silence so taut it felt like it might shatter. And Jasmine Crockett, standing firm, unshaken, was not about to let the moment dissipate. She reached down calmly like someone who'd done this 100 times in war rooms and depositions, and lifted a thick file from her folder. The edges were marked with sticky tabs, yellow, red, black, like flags planted on buried landmines. She placed the file on the desk with a quiet thud, flipped it open, and spoke with a kind of cold precision that made every head in the room turn. "Let's talk about influence," she said, the words slow and measured. "Not the influence of movements, but of money. Because while slogans shift, dollars never lie." Behind her, the monitor lit up, not with drama, but with data so dense and damning it didn't need dramatics. A donor map appeared, arrows stretching from PACs, foundations, and private entities, all converging on a single name glowing at the center in digital red: Nancy Mace for Congress. Jasmine didn't flinch. "This campaign," she began, her voice clipped and clear, "has accepted over $240,000 in contributions from groups that have publicly opposed Black Lives Matter, endorsed All Lives Matter rhetoric, and financially supported media efforts to undermine racial justice advocacy." Her finger pointed to one name: Liberty First Action Committee. This group spent over $500,000 funding misinformation ads targeting BLM protests as domestic terror. That same year, they gave $32,000 to Congresswoman Mace. A low rustle passed through the rows of observers. Jasmine let it settle, then twisted the knife. "But perhaps most disturbing," she said, advancing to the next page of the dossier, "is this organization, Law and Order Unity PAC." The name appeared on screen, sterile and unthreatening, until the subtext hit. "This PAC has a documented history of shielding departments under federal investigation for systemic misconduct. They lobbied to delay civil rights probes. They funded campaigns that painted police accountability as a threat to national stability. And yet," Jasmine paused, flipping to a highlighted record, "they funneled $15,500 into Congresswoman Mace's 2022 re-election war chest, just weeks before she made her now famous statement denouncing BLM as divisive." The temperature in the room collapsed. It wasn't shock, it was constriction, like the collective realization of something darker settling on the shoulders of everyone present. The journalists stopped typing. The aides stopped whispering. Even the security guards by the door shifted uncomfortably, sensing the gravity shift in real time. And Mace? She sat motionless. No pen in hand, no notes, no fallback expression of authority. Her lips parted for a second, then closed again. She blinked rapidly, and for the first time since the hearing began, her body language betrayed something unspinnable: panic. Jasmine remained standing. She didn't raise her voice. She lowered it, leaned slightly forward, gaze cutting through the fog of silence. "You can say BLM is dangerous," she said. "You can call it divisive. But when you do, the American people deserve to know. Are you speaking from conviction or from commission?" She held up the record one last time, not like a weapon, but like an affidavit, a mirror. Because when your donors are the ones financing the narrative that demonizes peaceful protesters and silences systemic truth, then your outrage is not moral, it's contractual. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy. The kind of silence that falls when a system is caught watching itself in real time and doesn't like what it sees. No one moved. No one even dared shift in their seat. Because in that moment, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just cross-examining a congresswoman. She was peeling back the thin layer of civility that protected power and exposing what was festering beneath. The weight of lobbyist cash and political betrayal still hung in the room like smoke after a fire. But Jasmine knew numbers weren't enough. Receipts spoke to the head. She needed to speak to the wound. She stepped slowly to the center of the chamber, no longer standing behind the desk or monitor. Instead, she reached into her folder and lifted a small, dog-eared photo. No caption, no design, just a smiling teenage boy, framed by the faded slats of a weathered basketball court. She held it up to the room. "This," she said gently, "is Elijah Porter." The image shifted to the screen behind her, full resolution now. His smile, warm and crooked, lit up the chamber more than any politician's speech ever could. Jasmine's voice dropped into something deeper, not softer, heavier. He was 16, a sophomore, straight A's, loved comic books, loved his mother. He died 2 years ago, shot by officers during a miscommunication. No weapon, no threat, just a hoodie, a backpack, and a skin color that made him a silhouette they thought was dangerous. She inhaled, slow and pained. They fired 6 rounds in under 4 seconds. 2 hit his chest, 1 hit his face. He was walking home from school. He never even got to hear them say, "Drop it." Jasmine turned slightly toward the gallery. "And this," she said as the screen behind her flickered, "is his mother." The chamber lights dimmed slightly as a live video feed appeared. In it sat Darlene Porter, shoulders hunched, face marked with sleepless years. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap like she was holding together the pieces of herself that grief kept trying to scatter. She didn't speak immediately. She looked into the lens, not at the politicians in the room, but at the millions she knew might finally see her now. When my son died, she said, her voice breaking in its first sentence, I waited for someone to call, someone from the news, someone who cared. Her hands trembled. But they told me there were no riots, no footage, that it wasn't newsworthy, just a tragedy. And then she began to cry. Not a camera-ready cry, but something primal. Her shoulders shook, her face crumpled. Her sobs came in waves, jagged and full of silence between them, as if her body had forgotten how to breathe without her son. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She stood still, spine straight, eyes wide open, letting every second drag out in full. She wanted the room to feel it, all of it, the kind of grief that doesn't land on front pages, the kind that dies quietly behind closed doors, the kind that never gets hashtags or headlines because it doesn't sell fear or fuel outrage. Just sorrow, just loss. No one moved. Not one pen scratched paper. Not one aide whispered behind a clipboard. And then the camera slowly, almost reluctantly, panned back to Nancy Mace. Her eyes were lowered, not in humility, but in retreat. Her spine, once stiff with confidence, had curved inward, like she was trying to disappear inside her own clothes. Her hands were no longer steady, her lips pressed so tightly together that the color drained from them. And though the screen beside her still displayed Darlene's face, eyes swollen, mouth still open in mourning, Mace refused to look. She stared at the table, not blinking, not speaking, not breathing. Because there are some truths so devastating, so pure, that even the architects of deflection can't survive their weight. And in that moment, beneath the image of a weeping mother and the ghost of her forgotten son, Nancy Mace met a silence no slogan could rescue her from. The stillness after the mother's testimony was not peace. It was pressure, compressed, silent, waiting to break. Jasmine Crockett, calm as ever, moved with the precision of someone holding a scalpel, not a microphone. She reached for a final file, thin, understated, but coiled like a live wire. With a subtle motion, she tapped her tablet. The microphones across the room gave a soft click, as if adjusting themselves. And then a voice emerged. Not Jasmine's, not the chairman's, but one instantly recognizable. It was Nancy Mace, her tone informal, off-script, and completely unaware she'd ever be heard outside the shadows. I'm just saying, came the words, grainy but unbroken. Supporting BLM right now is political suicide. It's not worth the mess. Let someone else be the hero. A beat of stunned silence followed, and then the room erupted. Chairs shifted sharply, eyes widened. Reporters bolted upright like triggered alarms. Staffers stared at one another, with expressions that couldn't decide between shock and dread. Mace froze. The color drained from her face, as if truth had pulled the blood straight from her veins. That's not mine, she stammered, but the voice kept playing, growing even more damning. The base doesn't want to hear about systemic anything. Stick to inflation. They'll forget the protest by November. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't interrupt. She let the recording wash over the room like a confession whispered in a dark hallway, finally dragged into the floodlights. Mace's panic metastasized. She glanced frantically at her aide, who looked just as stunned. Her mouth opened again. This is being taken out of context. But the tremble in her voice betrayed something deeper. She recognized the trap, and she knew she'd already walked into it. The audio stopped. Jasmine leaned forward. No theatrics, no grin, no smugness, just gravity. Her voice came low and scalpel sharp. Thank you for finally being honest, even if only behind closed doors. The words were a blade, but they didn't scream. They cut. They didn't accuse. They confirmed. Mace flinched, not from volume, but from exposure. Because nothing is more devastating than having your mask peeled off by your own mouth. No opposition talking point, no edited footage, no media hit piece. Just the truth, unscripted, and broadcast to a nation now watching not a leader, but a calculation gone wrong. There were no rebuttals, no applause, just that awful, cinematic stillness, the kind that settles in after something final has happened. Not because someone won, but because someone had finally been revealed. The chamber may have fallen silent, but beyond its walls, the political aftershocks began detonating in real time. And Jasmine Crockett's calm delivery of truth was about to become the storm America couldn't scroll past. The hearing had barely concluded when the nation's news cycle ignited like dry brush, meeting flame. Within 20 minutes, CNN broke in with a bold, all-caps Chiron, Mace caught in hot moment, Blum's stance called a political liability. Seconds later, MSNBC aired the full leaked clip alongside a still image of Mace, head bowed, visibly unraveling as Jasmine Crockett's words echoed behind her. But it was the Washington Post that delivered the fatal blow with their 5 p.m. headline. Rep. Nancy Mace accused of hypocrisy. Crockett presents damning audio, exposes donor ties. The words weren't inflammatory, they were surgical, because the world wasn't guessing anymore. It was watching, and what it saw wasn't just contradiction, it was collapse. Clips of Jasmine's unflinching line. "Thank you for finally being honest, even if only behind closed doors," exploded across every platform with the force of a cultural moment. On TikTok, creators stitched the footage into explainers, splicing in the DOJ reports and BLM protest footage Jasmine had presented earlier. On Instagram, her calm stare as Mace scrambled was reposted tens of thousands of times within the first hour. On Twitter, now X, one repost of the moment hit 3.1 million views in under 2 hours. The quote, clipped down to 6 words, "Was it you or your donors?" was already being printed on protest signs. Jasmine hadn't shouted, she hadn't grandstanded, but somehow she had detonated a reckoning with the steadiness of a surgeon and the emotional precision of a funeral eulogy. Her restraint was the revolution, and in the Republican caucus, panic began to seep like blood into white linen. That afternoon's scheduled press briefing, originally slated to include 6 Republican House members in a joint defense of Mace, began to unravel in whispers. First came the subtle cancellations. Representative, Keegan won't be able to attend due to scheduling. Then another. Then another. By the time the press arrived, only 2 lawmakers stood beside Mace, visibly stiff, their eyes darting toward the podium as if afraid of what might be played next. One of them refused to take questions altogether. The other gave a statement so vague it might as well have been written for a weather report. "We respect all our members. We continue to listen and learn." No conviction. No echo of Mace's earlier bravado. The room could smell it. Retreat. Reporters pushed forward. "Do you still stand by Congresswoman Mace's statement about Black Lives Matter?" one asked. A long pause. A flicker of discomfort. I think the Congresswoman's record speaks for itself," one aide muttered, eyes avoiding contact. Outside, protesters were already gathering. Not thousands, but hundreds. Enough to flood the sidewalks with placards that read, "Not just a movement, our lives." Some of the signs carried Jasmine's face next to a single word: receipts. The moment was no longer confined to a hearing room. It was breathing in the streets. Cable networks looped the confrontation like a courtroom drama gone viral. Political analysts were quick to weigh in. On CNN's evening panel, one strategist said flatly, "This was the clearest example of political authenticity overwhelming calculation I've seen in years." On Fox News, the tone was panic-drenched spin. "This is a setup. Who recorded Mace? This is entrapment." But even there, the host struggled to find traction, because the audio hadn't just caught a soundbite. It had revealed the strategy, the transactional rot beneath the statements that pretended to be moral positions, and viewers, across the spectrum, felt it. Back in Washington, Jasmine Crockett walked out of the Capitol that evening to a storm of microphones, but said nothing. No prepared statement, no tweet storm. Just a nod and a single sentence to a reporter near the front. "Truth doesn't need an encore." It echoed louder than most campaign speeches. Inside her office, her staff watched as the clip climbed trending charts. On Reddit, under Our Politics, a post titled, Crockett just gave a masterclass in surgical dismantling, surged to the top. Thousands of upvotes, thousands of comments. One of them read simply, "She didn't destroy Mace. Mace walked into her own trap, and Crockett just turned on the lights." And in the background, Nancy Mace's office issued a written statement at 6:44 p.m., bland, vague, and flat. The Congresswoman remains committed to bipartisan solutions for America's challenges. But no press conference followed. No interview requests were accepted. Rumors leaked that internal advisors had urged her to lay low until the firestorm passed. But everyone watching knew this wasn't a firestorm, this was a reckoning. And the reckoning had a face, a voice, a folder full of facts, and the quiet, devastating calm of someone who knew they'd just cracked a mask the entire nation had been squinting through for far too long. As dust settled over D.C., the Capitol's lights flickered on, illuminating a building that had witnessed centuries of power games. But tonight felt different. It wasn't just a scandal. It wasn't just a win. It was something colder, deeper. Jasmine hadn't screamed. She hadn't begged to be heard. She had simply told the truth and let it do what it always does when delivered without apology. Cut. The headlines had already broken. The damage had spread far beyond the Capitol's walls. But inside that chamber, Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. Because silence, she knew, was never neutral. It was always a weapon. And now it was time to name it. Jasmine stood at the center of the room, every word she had spoken still vibrating beneath the polished mahogany, every truth she'd unveiled still hanging in the oxygen-starved air. Her folder was closed, her voice steady, her presence unshakable. She wasn't performing, she wasn't posturing. She was delivering a final incision, one that would not bleed, but leave a scar on the conscience of everyone who had watched and said nothing. Slowly, she adjusted the microphone before her. The cameras focused. Reporters leaned forward without blinking. Even the stenographer, tapping furiously just minutes before, now paused. Jasmine's eyes swept across the room, not as a challenge, but as a reckoning. And then she spoke. "We keep asking why the country is so divided," she began, her voice low, unwavering. "Why justice feels so far away, why the truth keeps getting trampled by convenience." Her tone was not theatrical, but grave, like she was delivering a eulogy for something that still might be saved. "And maybe the answer," she said, "is simpler than we'd like to admit." She paused, and that pause was filled with something weightier than sound. History, raw and untended. Maybe it's not the protests. Maybe it's not the policies. Maybe it's the silence. The room shifted, a breathless murmur crawling through the gallery like wind before thunder. She let it settle, then finished. "We cannot let silence kill justice faster than bullets ever could." For a second, one suspended heartbeat, no one moved. The room felt vacuum-sealed, like all noise had been dragged out by the force of that one sentence. Then came the sound. First from the back rows, reporters, aides, spectators, then the sides. A wave of clapping, rising like the rumble before a downpour. And then, shockingly, impossibly, from across the aisle, a Republican staffer stood, hesitated, then began clapping with tight, measured hands. Another followed, and then a congressman, older, gray-templed, known for rarely breaking ranks, rose to his feet and joined them. The sound of bipartisan applause wasn't loud, but it was louder than silence, and that was the point. Even the chairman, typically stone-faced in moments of tension, bowed his head slightly, not as a signal of agreement, but as a recognition of something undeniable. Jasmine hadn't just spoken. She had indicted the silence of the entire institution. The applause wasn't political. It was human. It was the sound of guilt meeting gravity. The cameras swung back into motion, catching every angle, but one zoomed in tighter than the rest, onto Nancy Mace. Her posture had collapsed inward, not in exhaustion, but defeat. Her hands, once gripping the table with the confidence of control, now sat limp in her lap. Her eyes stared at the floor as if looking directly at the foundation cracking beneath her. The lights reflected off her skin, but there was no polish left, only a pale, rattled stillness. She didn't blink as the applause grew. She didn't move as Jasmine's words continued to echo. She just sat there, facing the consequence of her own exposure. Her mouth twitched once, like she wanted to speak, to respond, to defend. But no sound came. There were no talking points left, no safe phrases, no rescue from party allies who had either retreated or gone silent themselves. The chamber had shifted. The public had seen. The narrative was no longer hers to spin. It belonged to the voice that had filled the silence. Jasmine didn't wait for a standing ovation. She didn't raise her hands or nod in self-congratulation. She simply gathered her folder, turned, and walked away from the microphone like someone who had buried the weight of injustice at the feet of power, and knew the echo would handle the rest. The applause eventually faded. The room settled, but nothing returned to normal. Not the posture of those on the committee, not the temperature of the press, not the rhythm of Mace's breath. The silence Jasmine had condemned was now gone, and in its place, accountability had made a home. Outside the chamber, the sky over Capitol Hill had turned to steel. A storm wasn't coming. It had already arrived, and it bore Jasmine Crockett's voice in its thunder. The applause inside the Capitol had faded, but outside its marble walls, the echo of Jasmine Crockett's final words was transforming into something far more dangerous for Nancy Mace: public memory. And in her home district, that memory was no longer silent. 3 days later, in a modest community center on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina, the air was hot, thick with humidity and tension. Folding chairs were packed wall to wall, fans spinning helplessly overhead. Nancy Mace stood on stage with a strange smile, surrounded by an American flag, a white backdrop, and a podium that suddenly looked too tall for her. She had expected the usual handshake and photo op town hall. What she got instead was an ambush, not of violence but of facts, rage, and betrayal. The first question came from a local pastor, eyes blazing, voice unwavering. "Congresswoman, if Black Lives Matter was a cry for help in 2020, why did you call it a threat in 2024? Gas rippled through the crowd. Phones were already out, streaming, recording, archiving every twitch of her face. Mace cleared her throat, tried to smile. "I believe in law and order, Pastor Jenkins, and I also believe in accountability. Sometimes statements get taken out of context." The words died in the air. A woman in the second row stood up, gray-haired, holding a framed photo of her son. "They didn't take your voice out of context," she said. "They recorded it." Applause broke out, sharp and immediate, like a thunderclap inside a pressure chamber. Mace looked down. Her aide passed her a note. She didn't read it. She knew there was no script that could save her now. From there, it spiraled. At a veterans roundtable the following day, a retired Marine confronted her with a stack of receipts, campaign donations from PACs that had actively lobbied against police reform. "You served on armed services, ma'am," he said, voice steady but lethal. "You know what it means to take an oath. So tell me, when you accepted that money, who were you really serving?" Mace tried to pivot, tried to shift to small business policy, but the crowd wasn't interested in bullet points. They wanted blood. She was no longer their representative. She was a symbol of everything they'd been told was complicated, but now saw clearly: betrayal wearing pearls and a party badge. The fury didn't stay confined to public meetings. It spilled into Charleston's streets. On the steps of City Hall, under gray skies and a looming camera crew from NPR, local organizers launched the Not in Our Name coalition, a grassroots resistance campaign aimed specifically at unseating Mace. Flyers appeared overnight, posted on telephone poles and car windshields. She turned her back when it mattered most. Black and white posters showed a split image. One side was Mace at the 2020 rally, quoting BLM. The other, a still frame of her during the leaked audio playback, shoulders sunken, eyes hollow. The headline above read, "Which Mace will you elect?" It was simple, devastating, viral. Churches joined in. Community organizers who once stood on the fence now held meetings in basements and barbershops, coordinating call banks and voter outreach. Local activists canvassed neighborhoods with portable speakers playing audio clips from the hearing. One car drove slowly through downtown Charleston with a billboard strapped to its roof and Crockett's voice blasting from the windows. "We cannot let silence kill justice faster than bullets ever could." It wasn't a slogan. It was a charge. Inside Mace's district office, the phones rang nonstop. The staff, young, polished, exhausted, cycled through scripted responses, but the calls didn't slow. Some were angry, some were tearful, but all of them ended the same way. We heard her, we heard you, and we're not forgetting. Mace attempted to recalibrate. She tweeted a statement about restoring unity, attached with a smiling photo at a food pantry, but the comments flooded in within seconds. Unity with who? Your donors or the mothers you ignored? Sit this one out, Nancy. Even her verified allies offered no defense, no shares, no support, just silence, the very thing Jasmine had weaponized against her. The local press wasn't kind. The Charleston Gazette ran a full-page editorial titled, "When Politicians Say the Quiet Part Out Loud." It dissected the hypocrisy not as a gaffe, but as a worldview. Mace didn't stumble, the op-ed read. She revealed herself, and voters have the receipts. Across town, a group of students at the College of Charleston staged a walkout during a Mace-sponsored civic panel. One student held a sign with a single phrase, "We don't need spin, we need truth." A camera caught Mace's reaction, tight-lipped, eyes distant, a viral clip once again. In the days that followed, more civic groups joined the movement. The local NAACP chapter called for a formal censure. A veterans advocacy network suspended its endorsement pending review. The Charleston Interfaith Alliance sent a public letter signed by over 400 clergy across denominations, denouncing Mace's comments and demanding an apology to the Black community. She gave one, eventually, but it was dry, legalistic, full of qualifiers. No one bought it. Not anymore. The trust had collapsed, and in its place stood a city watching closely, documenting everything, refusing to forget. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She didn't need to. Her words had already burrowed into the soil of South Carolina like seeds, and now they were blooming into rebellion. As Nancy Mace's district ignited in protest and her political foundation cracked beneath her, a different kind of momentum was building around Jasmine Crockett, one not fueled by outrage, but by reverence. America wasn't just watching her anymore. It was inviting her in. The first invitation came 48 hours after the hearing's live stream had crossed 20 million views. It arrived not through a press secretary or pipe, but directly from the dean of Harvard Law. A simple message. "We'd be honored to have you speak. Your voice belongs here." Jasmine didn't respond right away. She sat in her office, staring out at the dust-soaked skyline of D.C., her phone lighting up every few seconds with another producer request, another op-ed, another headline. But this was different. This wasn't a booking. It was a recognition, not of celebrity, but of clarity, the kind only truth can produce when it survives scrutiny and walks out of the fire untouched. When she stepped onto the stage at Harvard's Sanders Theater, the applause didn't erupt. It rose, like a tide, slow and swelling, not from spectacle but substance. Professors in press suits stood beside students in hoodies and sneakers, all of them clapping in unison, as if they knew they weren't just witnessing a guest lecture. They were witnessing a response to history. Jasmine didn't smile for the cameras. She didn't scan the crowd for validation. She walked to the podium with the same calm that had dismantled a congressional lie days earlier. And when she reached the mic, she paused, not to gather herself, but to let the weight settle. She began not with a headline, but with a name. "Elijah Porter," she said, and the room inhaled. She told the story again, not for politics, not for press, but because the story deserved to be heard in a place that still claimed to produce leaders. She moved through the timeline, not dramatically, but with surgical precision, showing how facts get buried, how footage gets framed, and how justice drowns in a silence engineered by people who fear its volume. "They told me to sit down. They told me not to make it personal," she said, eyes sweeping the balcony. "But when children are dying and mothers are crying and no one reports it because it won't get clicks, then silence is personal." A pause. Silence is complicity in a suit. The applause that followed was thunderous, not a standing ovation out of obligation, but out of release. Professors wiped their eyes. A former judge stood in the back, hands trembling as he clapped. And when Jasmine stepped off that stage, she wasn't escorted out as a guest. She was surrounded. Students crowded her, not for selfies, but to ask, "What do we do next?" Not "How did you do it?" but "Where do we take this?" And Jasmine answered the same way she had in Congress. Not with sound bites, but with blueprints for resistance. She didn't offer hope. She offered strategy. That night, CNN ran a one-hour special titled "The Reckoning, Jasmine Crockett and the Age of Accountability." It opened with a shot of her walking through Harvard Yard in a navy coat, flanked by law students who walked not behind her, but beside her. Across America, networks scrambled to book her. MSNBC aired an entire Sunday segment called Crockett Unfiltered, which went viral not for drama, but for its closing moment. Jasmine looked straight into the camera and said, "We keep asking the system to be fair, but maybe the question isn't about fairness anymore. Maybe it's about whether we're ready to stop asking and start demanding." That clip was replayed across 6 networks within a day. Even the networks that had once ignored her began to pivot. ABC's Nightline invited her for a primetime conversation. CBS ran a profile piece that opened with her walking through her childhood neighborhood. Low income, over-policed, and, as she put it, always invisible until someone bled. But the interview didn't center on trauma. It centered on strategy. "You didn't just expose a congresswoman," the interviewer said. "You exposed an entire machine." Jasmine nodded. "I didn't bring it down," she said. "I just showed people where the cracks were." At The View, where the hosts were known for light commentary and rehearsed conflict, Jasmine arrived to a standing ovation, not from the audience, but from the panel itself. Even the most cynical host admitted on air, "We're so used to people dancing around the truth. You walked in with it and dropped it on the table." Jasmine smiled, not out of pride, but out of exhaustion. "I didn't want to be the one to say it," she replied, "but too many people have paid for my silence." And yet, for all the stage lights and studio backdrops, it wasn't the networks that defined her moment. It was the people, the ones whose pain never made it to broadcast. They began sending her letters, handwritten ones, some from mothers, some from inmates, one from a retired officer who wrote, "I was the problem. Thank you for showing me how I became it." Her team started receiving poetry, art, and audio clips from students reciting her words like scripture. In Detroit, a teacher played her speech to a classroom of 12-year-olds. In Oakland, a church printed her Harvard quote on a banner and hung it above the pulpit. In Tulsa, a protester carried a sign that read simply, "Because she didn't blink, I won't either." And through it all, Jasmine kept moving, not to capitalize, but to mobilize, not to bask, but to build. Because she knew fame could fade, but impact, when forged in fire, would not. And while Mace tried to repair her image with filtered photo ops and carefully worded damage control, Jasmine's words had already entered the bloodstream of a country looking for something real. Not polished, not rehearsed, real. She didn't need to shout anymore. The world was already listening, and now it was following. She had stood on some of the nation's grandest stages, lit up television screens, and ignited a movement. But when the cameras dimmed and the world asked the question it had been waiting to ask, Jasmine Crockett's answer came not with noise, but with clarity that cut like glass. The interview took place in a quiet studio, no cheering crowds, no roaring applause, just the soft hum of stage lights and the low rustle of makeup brushes being tucked away. Jasmine Crockett sat across from a veteran political journalist, the type known more for grilling senators than offering praise. But tonight, there was no ambush. There was only curiosity. The camera zoomed in as the host leaned forward, fingertips pressed together. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said with deliberate care, "many people have praised your composure during the hearing, but some also asked, why didn't you respond immediately when Mace first made that remark? Why not shut it down in the moment?" For a brief second, Jasmine said nothing. She just tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing, not in offense but in calculation. Then came the smile, not wide, not performative, a small, private curve of the lips, like someone holding back a fire until the room could handle its heat. "Because justice," she said, her voice low and razor-sharp, "doesn't need to scream." She paused, letting the weight of that one line settle before continuing. It needs truth, and truth doesn't always punch fast. It waits, it builds, it watches. And then, when it's ready, it drops the floor out from under a lie. The room fell still, the camera catching every flicker of emotion in her eyes. I knew she had built her defense on performance, Jasmine said, and I wasn't there to play her game. I was there to end it. The journalist blinked, stunned silent for a moment, before nodding slowly. Across the country, millions watched that answer unfold in real time. Clips of it were replayed before the hour was up. But the most striking thing wasn't the words themselves. It was how still Jasmine remained as she said them. No dramatics, no gesturing, just that quiet, calibrated force she had carried through every hearing, every headline, every televised confrontation. She didn't radiate confidence. She radiated conviction, the kind forged by fire, not cameras. The interview moved on, but that quote became its own story. Within hours, media outlets blasted the line across their banners. Justice